Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture. I am Eric Trexler, one of your dear hosts, joined as always by Dr. Eric Helms. And today is a special treat, a really exciting episode for purely selfish, self interested reasons. So, we are joined today by the Dr. Jim Stoppani. And for a little background, think back to a simpler time. The year was 2004. I was a freshman, maybe sophomore wrestler back in Ohio. And I started to really take a liking to lifting weights and nutrition and things like that. One of my assistant coaches saw that in me and said, when the team's doing their workouts, we're going to do our workouts. And this coach was jacked. He was just a phenomenal athlete. When he wanted to be a bodybuilder, he blew up. When he wanted to get into marathons, he was below 3 hours by like snapping his fingers, just a freak. But he took me under his wing and we trained and trained and trained. We talked nutrition and it really set me on the trajectory for everything I've done in my life since. And the single source material that we based our workouts on, that we talked about nutrition about, it was all Jim Stoppani's content in Muscle and Fitness magazine. So for me, you get on a podcast, people do all the flowery introductions. This is straight from the heart. I couldn't be more stoked, and I'm excited for this conversation. So, Jim, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you guys for the invite.
Absolutely. So, Helms, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo it with my own, kind of backstory. I started lifting in 2004, not as early as you, Trex, but same exact era. I was still in the U.S. Air Force, kind of near the end of my enlistment.
Thanks for your
And
service.
oh no, my pleasure. Thank you. And I jumped on the bodybuilding.com forums to start learning things. And I was also reading all the muscle magazines because that's what you did at the time. And, there was a handful of people who spoke to my natural skepticism. And it was many of the people who were doing the kind of progenitor to the evidence-based space that we have today, that Trex and I are very privileged and have the pleasure of being kind of embedded in. And one of them, of course, was you, Dr. Stoppani. So sometimes I talk about Dr. Lane Norton, but there were definitely people who preceded that. And I think for anyone who wants to walk a entrepreneurial path in fitness, it's very difficult to do that without knowing that it's possible and seeing what has come before and having it modeled. So I just wanted to say, thank you for basically doing that and taking academia and lifting and actually paving that pathway as one of the few who did that in an era where it was quite uncommon and before it was even really an evidence-based space.
True, yes.
Yeah, so Jim, along those lines, I think a good starting point for this conversation is going to be wide ranging. We're going to talk about your background. We're going to talk about how science communication and the science kind of online culture has evolved over the years, because you're one of the few who is there from the beginning. I mean, in the modern era, I mean, you were there writing the magazine articles. We were talking before we started recording, before forums were even really much of a thing in the fitness space. Facebook didn't exist. I don't think YouTube even existed. And YouTube existed for a while before it blew up. So, this was like all the way back where, there were very few channels for bodybuilding communication that was scientific in nature. But before we even get to you writing those articles as a postdoc, one of my questions is, how did you know that you wanted to even pursue education in exercise science? Because I didn't even know it was a field until I was reading your articles. So how did you find your way to that in the first place?
Yeah, so it was through the very magazines that you know me from. It was Muscle and Fitness. I was reading that when luckily my father was into weightlifting. He was a Marine. He was a boxer. His father was a boxer, professional boxer. So that culture was in my family. It wasn't like weightlifting was some weird thing I was doing. It was very much encouraged by my father and my family. So I started working out with my father in the basement, and he would bring home, it wasn't Muscle and Fitness then, it was, what was it called then? Muscle Power. But, so I would flip through the magazines and, Joe Weider was having actual PhDs write articles about muscle fiber type, lactate threshold, things like that. And so as a 13-year-old, I'm absorbing all this information, nutrition. I was cooking for myself even at 13. I was making my own meals because I wanted to make sure I was getting my macros, way back then. But it was really through muscle and fitness. I thought, wow, look at this. There are people that are actually studying exercise and muscle. And I'm like, can you imagine doing that for a living? And so I, continued weightlifting. I got into competitive bodybuilding, as a teenager. Collegiate Nationals, I did the Junior USA, I won the NPC Connecticut, East Coast, and then the Coastal USA. But all through, I was studying, exercise science. And when I started as an undergrad, I grew up in Connecticut. I went to a very blue, and the Connecticut I grew up in is very blue collar. It's not, your Martha Stewart, Connecticut that you're thinking of. It's very,
Not like the
very blue
cliche
collar.
boarding schools
Yeah.
that are 80
And
grand a year.
yeah. So I went to the, normal public high school. And there was really no one who could sort of lead me in that direction of what I needed to do. So I assumed, maybe I'll go into orthopedics, it's the closest thing to sports and medicine and science. And so I did an undergrad at University of Connecticut I was either going to physical therapy, possibly as a start, right, as my entry, or into sports medicine, which was athletic training, not even exercise physiology, right, or sports physiology. It was, I worked with the UConn basketball team, which was amazing, taping ankles and doing massages and, cold and heat, contrast therapy, all that sort of stuff. So that was my, intro into exercise science, if you will. But it wasn't until I took my first exercise physiology course and they were talking about growth hormone and testosterone. And then I was lucky enough, my advisor, I don't know if you guys know who Bill Kramer is or anybody who's listening, but Bill
100%.
Kramer was my undergrad advisor. And so he would be talking to me about the research he was doing. I'm like, you're studying growth hormone release during weightlifting? What? I had no idea any of this was going on, and so that really opened my eyes. Lucky enough to have Bill Kramer, and again, this is before he was the Bill Kramer, the resistance training, expert that he is. So I was very lucky to have that, involvement early on, and so I went on to get a master's. I went to Auburn for biomechanics, actually, and was lucky enough there because Bill Kazmaier, the world's strongest man?
Yes.
He lived in Auburn, and he would come into the lab. He was one of our subjects. We would study Bill Kazmaier in the lab, not college dudes. You know what I mean? We were studying biomechanics on the world's strongest man. And God, this has nothing to do with anything, but he would do overhead one arm with a 130-pound dumbbell. It was insane.
And for the people listening, when
was-
he says overhead one arm, he's not talking about presses. He's talking
Yes,
about
I'm talking
tricep
about an
extensions.
overhead tricep with a 130-pound dumbbell. Obviously he was altered, but regardless, what a freak. So, I had a lot of great experiences early on. I never thought that I would ever leave academia. I thought that was what I was going to do. I was going to stick with academia. I went on to do a postdoc at Yale School of Medicine, but I always thought back to the magazines, and always thought, hey, what if I can turn the research that I'm doing into applicable information for people? And so I knew someone who went to UConn with me as an undergrad and moved out to LA and knew Tom Dieters, who was the editor-in-chief of Muscle Fitness at the time. And so I asked her, I said, if I send you a couple articles, would you mind sending them to Tom? And she's like, oh, are you kidding? For sure. I'm sure he would love your stuff. So I sent it to her. She sent it to Tom. He had Joe Weider look at it. They loved the stuff. And so they hired me on as a freelance writer. And so while I was at Yale School of Medicine running rats down in the basement, I would be on my laptop writing, turning the research into, like what this meant for a lifter in the, in the gym, in the kitchen, and whatnot. And eventually they needed a science editor. And so they, reached out to me and said, would you have any interest in leaving academia and becoming our science editor? And I'm like, fly me out there, let's talk. And, obviously I took the job much to the confusion of all my colleagues. I mean, they sat me down. They, tried to do like an intervention. They thought I was throwing my entire career away. Here I am set up at Yale School of Medicine. I'm in the Department of Cellular and Molecular Physiology with grant money, with a career, like, you're going to be a professor at Yale School of Medicine. Why would you give that up? I'm like, look, this is really my calling, because here I am, I'm doing research on genes and different metabolic pathways. And as I'm doing my PubMed search, I would see a new article on creatine and be like, oh, I didn't have time to read that. I've got to get funding. I've got to get papers written, and so all this research that I was really interested in was just going by. I didn't have time. And, when Muscle and Fitness offered me that position, I thought, this is a way for somebody to finally bridge the gap between what's going on in the lab and how do you apply it? Because anytime you ask an exercise scientist or other scientists about their study, let's say it's broccoli, they found a study that said, broccoli helped prevent cancer. So would you recommend broccoli, Dr. So-and-so? Oh, I'm not saying I would recommend broccoli. I'm just saying this is what the data showed, nobody wanted to go out on that limb and actually give any advice on the research that was being put out there. So I really saw that as a great opportunity for me to be able to bridge that gap, because not only did I have the science background and the interest, but I was a competitive bodybuilder. I've been doing this, literally lifting weights since I was a kid all my life. And, I really saw this as a great opportunity. And one of the few people that could really, at the time, this is, over 20 years ago, at the time, to really bring that information to the general public in a way that's, usable and understandable for them. And so really that was my start.
Yeah, I had a similar a similar set of experiences, honestly, where I didn't know exercise science existed. So I was like, I'll be a physical therapist close enough. I'll figure a way to be interested, and then got involved with some exercise science coursework and just couldn't look back, and then similarly, like you were talking after your postdoc, kind of going into the industry route and people kind of sitting you down and saying, Jim, you're throwing a lot away here. I mean, I remember when I right after my PhD, I'm back in the academic world now, but I took like a little 5-year detour when I was out of it completely. And I remember people, that conference circuit, you do the summer conferences, presenting your research. I had at least a few people pull me aside and say, Eric, I heard some nasty rumors that you were going and doing this. And I just need you to tell me they're not true. But yeah, it's one of those things where, you could almost get caught in that trap, that kind of sunk cost fallacy, where you were exploring this science because it tapped into your passion for the bodybuilding, the lifting, the nutrition. And if you're not careful, you're so busy pursuing it through that route, you forget to link it back to where you started, linking it back into that passion.
Precisely,
so,
yes.
I know selfishly for me, I'm glad that you did, because without the work you were doing in that time period, I never really would have found my way into this kind of whole set of interests. So, it's really fortuitous that you did that. I was curious, so you were, Yale School of Medicine, and you're like, I'm going to go all in on science communication. So you jump into the what is now seen as kind of the old school, print magazine industry from the academic world. What was that transition like? I mean, you were there in the heyday of fitness magazines, in my opinion. What was that culture like? What was it like to communicate science in that era?
There was definitely a learning curve. I had a minor in my undergrad, a minor in English. So I had a real interest in writing. In fact, my PI at Yale, when the first grants I wrote, he sat me down and says to me, "Your writing's too good." And I'm like, "Well, how can it be too good?" He's like, "Your grant can't tell a story." He's like,
Yeah.
like it's just got to be information. Like,
Yeah.
it's too good. Like you wrote, like what you write. This isn't how to write a grant. It's very basic, and so I had writing skills already. No, nothing compared to the writers that I worked with, which was another thing. All my colleagues that when I was at the magazines would be like, "Oh, I'm a great writer," and I'm just like, "Look, dude, I used to think I was a great writer, but once you've been around real writers, like people who can really use words, properly and tell a real story and make you interested, you're not a good writer. Trust me. We'll take your content. You're a content. I'm a content writer. That was my thing, but it was quite a learning curve because you're going from writing for other scientists to writing to a 16-year-old, and so
14, but close enough.
yeah, whatever, right? So what I would do is I would always like turn back the clock and think that I'm writing to myself as a 15 or 16-year-old, or I'm explaining this to my mom. If my mom wanted to know what VO2 max was, how would I explain that to her in simple, you know what I mean? And a lot of scientists get caught up in that, oh, I got to impress my colleagues and use all these big words, and it's like, no, you need to use the simplest, most common words. It's almost impossible to explain what VO2 max is without using any of those terms that you're used to. You know what I mean? Like, what does it mean? And that was what was really important. I had one executive editor who was also a bodybuilder, not a competitive bodybuilder, but he was one of the few. When I got to Muscle and Fitness, I expected it to be this campus with a research lab and a gym. And it was literally just a bunch of editors, few who actually worked out. And so, one of the ones that did and knew how to work out and actually knew how to write really worked with me on my writing, which helped tremendously. But what I ended up doing for them was teaching them how to use me better. It's like, don't have me write this whole art. You've got me, writing, if I'm going to write an article, or you got me editing some trainer stuff. And the trainer doesn't know anything about, muscle contraction. So now I'm fixing all his stuff. And then when you have me write my own articles, I'm involved with, I have to come up with the intro to get them interested in it. I'm like, look, here's what you need to do. You need to use me as a content writer. And then you send it off to this editor who's a great writer, and he's going to add the intro. He's going to say, trying to build your biceps is like Britney Spears trying, you know what I mean? Like, he's going to get a hook in there. Just like today in a video, you can't start off your video by going, "Hi, I'm Dr. Jim Stoppani, and today I'm going to talk about muscle." There's got to be something creative there that's going to grab somebody. And so we finally created this system where I would write the workout or the nutrition plan or the article and the supplements, and other editors would come in after and then clean that up and make it more sensible to the average person. So it was a great, great opportunity because I really learned how to make it simple and easy to understand. I think that's the comment that I appreciate the most. I think when people say, what I love about your stuff is that it's so easy to understand. And I'm like, thank you. That means I did my job.
Now, on the flip side of
that's
that,
critical.
If I may, Helms, one
Sure.
of the things that's been interesting as the kind of evidence-based fitness content world has expanded, and it's a lot easier to get feedback whether you want it or not, right? Nowadays you don't print the magazine and send it out. It's you post the thing and there's
you
a
didn't
whole
have to write for
comment.
physical letters to come in.
Yeah, exactly. So now you post it. There's comments straight at you. There's people making content about your content, saying how wrong it is. So I wonder, how did you run into a lot of kind of balancing, because if you go like, I'm going to make this as simple to understand as I possibly can, the more that you shed some of that nuance, some people who are purists, who are really into the nitty gritty, will then sometimes critique that content and say, you've oversimplified it. It's way more complicated
Yes.
than this. Like, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. How did you kind of navigate that balance throughout your career? Did you run into that a lot?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's finding a middle ground,
Yeah.
where, you're able to explain it using simple terms, but a PhD can still read it and appreciate
Yeah.
appreciate it, and look, my audience is the layperson, but I think it's like you said, the layperson who's a little more read, who's a little, who wants a little more, who's who's interested in maybe a 3-minute video versus 15 seconds, who
Right.
has the attention span to read a little more. And so I would like to think that my content sort of is in that middle ground,
Yeah.
where it's not oversimplified. It's some of it is. You just you have to oversimplify it for most people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, it really comes down, like I've found that, if I'm contributing to content on some platform, the first thing I ask them is, who's this for? And that's
Yes.
ultimately going to tell you
Who's the audience?
how far down that slope of simplifying do we go? And if you're going to give a community presentation at a nursing home to convince people to use the gym on campus, do a little bit of lifting, and eat a little extra protein at breakfast, like, there's no reason for you to go and try to prove to everyone you're the smartest person in the room. And Jim, one of the things I've always appreciated about your content is when you are publishing in those kind of venues where it makes sense to simplify. I think you are really good at simplifying without totally oversimplifying, and also just exercising what I view as a little bit of almost kind of like intellectual restraint of saying, I could dazzle you with the details and the nuances. If I wanted to confuse you, I could, but I won't. And I think a lot of times that restraint of saying, there's nothing to prove here. It's just about conveying the information at the level it's intended. I think that's what makes, a really, really good communicator of science. And I mean, you are still, doing excellent science communication in the industry. You've been doing it at this point for, what is that, going on 30 years at this point? So I think that's evidence that you found a formula that works.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a question for you. You mentioned, which I found really cool and initially surprising, but then when you think about it, not surprising, that you were reading, when you were coming up, PhDs who'd been hired by Muscle and Fitness and writing these articles. I'm wondering, when you were reading, who were some of the writers with PhDs and other science communicators who were inspiring you? My first thought was maybe a Fred Hatfield, or I'm trying to think who else was doing it. Probably in the 90s and 80s when you would have been reading this.
Yeah, definitely Fred. I think Fred Hatfield stands out. Dr. Squab. Some of you may know him as, but it would also just be random, not anybody with a name, just a researcher at, University of California, Davis, who
Right.
was looking at whatever lactate or, muscle fiber type, or, you know what I mean? It was different, not any known entities in the field, just research scientists who are known in academia that he would bring into the magazine to get that information.
Gotcha. And a parallel question to that is, because you actually have a true background in academia, you can tell when someone is leveraging an academic background to use science to sell something rather than accurately representing what we think is truly going on. And I have seen, even in my relatively short tenure as a science communicator, phases where science has come in and out of vogue.
Yes.
Have you seen that?
Right,
Is
right,
that a
right.
repeated cycle? I would love to hear your take on how science is sometimes co-opted for marketing, and other times it is almost kind of like this corner thing, and the bros will like, yeah, whatever, we don't need that nonsense, you pencil neck geek. as someone who has always been a lifter, but is also a researcher, how have you navigated that changing dichotomy and the kind of those waves? And do you ever find yourself, I have found myself as an outgroup from both in times where, science isn't cool, then I lose my lifter card. And in times when science is cool, my lifter card actually hurts me because I'm not, like, oh, he's just a bodybuilder, and some other more pure quote unquote academics won't give me respect. So it's a funny thing to be like. Trex and I recently had an experience where we got called just powerlifting coaches when we published a meta regression on protein, and only a few weeks later did I get someone who was basically critiquing it for not being for me, just for the opposite side of it. Either I'm not sciencey enough for the scientists, or I'm not hardcore enough for the lifters. And I wonder how you've navigated that over the
Yeah,
years. And this is
that's
an
interesting.
extension.
Also, it also reminds me of something else where I'm not big enough, or I'm too, like, literally I'll post something and there'll be 5 comments that go steroids, he's on steroids, and then there's also 5 comments, do you even lift? Do you? And that's just like, which way is it, guys? Do I have any muscle, or do I have too much muscle? And it's just like, it's interesting with the, science is sort of out of vogue, but I mean, I haven't really changed it. I mean, I literally I'm just an educator, and when I was getting my PhD at University of Connecticut, luckily they literally had a course for your PhD, like a course just on getting your PhD, what to expect, what you do next, a postdoc. And my professor said something that I still hold on today. He says, you have a responsibility to share what you've learned with as many people who are willing to listen to you. That is your responsibility. And I've never, ever forgotten that. And that is literally all I work on, that's my responsibility, to take what I've learned in the gym, in the lab, and teach people, anyone who's willing to listen. So whether science is, everybody wants the guy with the PhD, or they don't want to listen to the guy with the PhD, I've never really changed how I do it. But it's so interesting when, like you said, you see this and it's just like, oh, now nobody wants to hear from the person with the PhD who's been doing it for 40 years in the gym and in the lab. Like, that's interesting. Or there's ageism, that's another thing. At 57 years old, I'll get comments that go, shut up, old man. Oh, thanks, pops. And it's weird because many other cultures, the experience that person has is appreciated and they want to hear. Whereas, on social media, it's like, I don't want to hear from you. I'd rather listen to a guy who's been in the gym for 2 years and is on a bunch of, trend. That's the guy I want to listen to. You know what I mean? And it's just, it is what it is. And like I said, I just continue doing my thing.
It's really interesting the way you put that, because I think it segues into kind of the way science communication has changed, specifically within the like bodybuilding and fitness space. Because, I mean, Helms, I don't think I'm wrong here. I feel like back in the day, if you go back a decade or two, when people were seeking out their sources of information, it seemed to me like people had a greater appreciation for well-roundedness in their information sources. So, for example, like you were saying, Jim, people would not just, you would want to hear from the person with the academic credentials. You would want to hear from the huge guy with no academic credentials. And you'd want to hear from the guy who's been doing it well for 35 years. Because I feel like we generally, as a lifting culture, believed, I'm sure this guy has run into every problem I'm running into right now, And it seemed like people had a lot of appreciation for all those different facets. But after, this is a good transition for your kind of career trajectory, after it was, very magazine focused, Then we get into the digital age, right? And it's forums, and that took off into nowadays. I feel like people really pick a lot of their fitness information based on their favorite, essentially micro celebrity. It's
Yeah.
personality oriented. I want to watch the YouTube videos of the person that I find engaging and cool, and I kind of aspirationally view as a peer almost. So it's this interesting thing where there you will find people who will say, okay, that person has been studying this for 15 years, not interested. That person's been a good lifter for 25 years, not interested. This person's been in the gym for 36 months and is already on a bunch of gear, but man, their videos are funny. So like I'm
Yeah.
all in, and however they train, that's me now.
Right.
But I want to hear more a little bit. What clearly from the outside looking in, you transitioned from very magazine focused, a lot of writing, and then you were doing more multimedia stuff. I remember you were really big in bodybuilding.com. So was that one of those things where the industry started moving and you were kind of a ship in that tide, or was that something that you proactively said, I want to aim toward the future and get in on this kind of digital media space?
Yeah, well, the mistake that most companies make, like Muscle and Fitness, is they they don't view themselves as a fitness media company. They view themselves as a magazine or a website, right? And so with Muscle and Fitness, when I was at Muscle and Fitness, my business partner, who I now work with, he was in advertising at Muscle and Fitness, but he had a master's degree in exercise science, and he was very savvy digitally. And so they put him in charge of building up the Muscle and Fitness website. But they didn't know what they wanted to do with it. They thought it would cannibalize the magazines. And so they really didn't want much content. They wanted him to just take the old content and sort of repurpose it. And so, we would have conversations all the time in my office. And, he one day says, would you ever consider making some videos? We can put them on the and I'm like, sure, And so I'm like, but, we should bring it up at an editorial meeting, because I've got a lot of articles to write. And so he brings up at the meeting, and everybody laughs. They're just like, videos? Like, who's going to no, nobody's going to watch Jim do a video on the bench press. Who the hell would want that? Nobody's going to want that. And so I took him aside later and said, let's just do it. And so, I shot my first video in my garage. There's paint cans on the shelf behind me. I had like a power rack in there, and I'm doing a little thing on the bench press. And the views went through the roof, absolutely through the roof. And then bodybuilding.com contacted me. They wanted me to start doing for free. You know what I mean? And sure, I'm science editor for Muscle and Fitness. As long as you make my, put my credentials as Muscle and Fitness, it sort of, benefits both.
Yeah, a little
both
cross promotion
parties.
kind of thing. Yeah.
And let me tell you, this is when Joe Weider sold the magazines to American Media. I don't know if you know the name David Pecker at all. David, he owns, National Enquirer, all those. And so they came in and they didn't want me doing anything on bodybuilding.com. They didn't want any videos up because they thought it would cannibalize the magazines. Well, people are going to stop reading the magazines, and eventually we showed them that that's not the case. You sort of need to have both. But then they complained about my content on bodybuilding.com, even though we showed them that the majority of the traffic coming to muscleandfitness.com was from bodybuilding.com, because people would find my content on bodybuilding.com, and at the end was a bio and a link to muscleandfitness.com. They wanted to put an end to that. In fact, the reason I left Muscle and Fitness was they gave me an ultimatum. I either had to stop working with bodybuilding.com or they were going to fire me. And so I said, well, I'll see you guys later. They were shocked, because there's no way you can tell me print is a better medium for teaching somebody how to do an exercise. That's why I gravitated. When my business partner came and said, would you ever consider doing videos? I'm like, yes. How much easier is it to teach somebody how to do a bench press when you're actually showing them how to do a bench press versus just words? You know, you try teaching somebody how to tie their shoe with an article.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Think about that. All those nuances of what you have to do with the lace and the looping with just words. It's very, very difficult to do. So a bench press, plank, whatever you have. I've been doing that for years, writing in text and wanting a better way. And video was the better way. And once I started working in the video, I didn't even see the point of article. I mean, why would you want to go back to writing? So I literally quit Muscle and Fitness because they didn't want me doing videos for bodybuilding.com, even though I wasn't getting paid and it was bringing, traffic back to their website. And bodybuilding.com, their mistake was they saw themselves as a website, not as a media platform. I had my app, Jim Stoppani fitness app on my phone in 2008. Bodybuilding.com didn't even have an app in 2008.
Man, 2008 to be having a fitness app, that is way ahead of the curve. Yeah.
But
It is.
but to not have one as, but again, I know most people who are watching right now or listening have no clue what bodybuilding.com was, but it was the biggest platform to get any information on lifting or supplementation. It was a massive, massive, massive platform. You really can't understand how big of a platform that was, but to not have an app and to take that long to have an app, but
Yeah. Well, no, and I mean your career kind of trajectory. I'm kind of chuckling because it is 100% my consumer trajectory as I was getting into lifting. Because, like I said, I was glued to your Muscle and Fitness magazine articles, and then I increasingly found myself going over to bodybuilding.com for video content and engaging in the forums, which is where I first became aware of this other guy, this Eric Helms on the other side of the screen. And those bodybuilding.com forums, still today, a lot of the people who are really seen as kind of the more prominent voices in our little niche that Helms and I are in, it was all from, just like notable threads in the forums and prolific posters in the forums. So you leave Muscle and Fitness because of this ultimatum. At that point, do you get a position with bodybuilding.com, or are you just kind of entrepreneurial, making money with your own endeavors, and then just kind of doing, at that time, bodybuilding.com was, the jackpot in terms of just broad exposure. We were talking offline. How many millions of people, I think it was called Shortcut to Size, the series that you did.
Yes.
So what did that look like when you transitioned out of Muscle and Fitness?
So I had already had my own website.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just, it was, you go on there with an app in 2008 with workouts. And so, it was a membership based website. So I was making money from that. And then I had never considered a supplement line. I'm not a businessman, I'm a scientist. But it was my business partner. We started with the website and he's like, don't you think it's time, you finally came out with your own supplement? You're teaching people how to make a pre-workout. You're telling them how much creatine, beta-alanine, and, betaine to put in there. What if we just streamlined that for them and made a pre-workout supplement? And I was working with a manufacturer that was going to make it for me. We pitched it to bodybuilding.com. Bodybuilding.com loved the concept. They're all like, Jesus, if Jim Stoppani made a supplement, I would buy it for sure, And so they were interested, but they didn't want to work with the manufacturer that I had because they had their own manufacturer, which was Century, massive manufacturing company. And so we changed the business structure to where they would have Century do the manufacturing, and then I would sell it to them. And over that was an overnight success. The launch of pre-gym, my pre-workout, was literally, within a year, it became the number one selling product on bodybuilding.com. you know, and it's because of the platform. I was educating. I didn't have to sell them anything, you know. These people already knew my formulas based on what I was telling them to take. They saw that the formula was almost exactly what I was recommending prior. And it was just going from buying, you know, 7 or 8 tubs of products that all tasted like crap when you mixed them together into all the same ingredients, but now in a nice flavor system. So that's how I, you know, sort of stayed alive, you know, without a job, if you will.
Yeah, and it is funny because I mean, one of the recurring themes here is, you know, this really pervasive fear of like we have to keep the good stuff hidden, right? So for example, the magazine saying, well, we can't cannibalize our content, so only the crap goes on the website, minimal crap, and then we can not crap, but the older stuff,
No, I got you.
you
Yeah,
know.
of
But you
course.
know, we
Yep.
want to keep the good stuff over here, kind of
Where you have to
siloed.
pay
Exactly, yeah, behind the
paid
paywall.
content. Yeah.
Yeah, and same thing, like, you know, a lot of people might say, like, well, if I'm going to have a successful supplement company, I can't be out there writing articles about how much you should take of this and that and the other thing. And ironically, it's like the more I'm in the space, I realize not only is it okay to do it this other way, it's kind of the only good way to do it is to say, like, I'm going to give you content because you're going to like it and because you're going to think this is really good and you're probably going to want more. And same thing, like with supplements, I'm going to tell you what the science says about what you ought to take in terms of supplementation because you want to use that information. You're going to start viewing me as a credible source on this topic. And frankly, when I give you the product, it's not like the secret Jim Stoppani formula that no one can ever find out about. You know, we're not talking about like IP secrets here. It's just saying, you know, you want to take this stuff because I've laid out what the science says, but like, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to go out and buy 6 ingredients and then you mix them and that was a big trend back in the day, making your own pre-workout, and they always tasted awful, you know, because it turns
Horrible.
out the people that do the flavoring are actually geniuses and very, very good at it. But yeah, it's like, you know, there's a lot of value in giving the value first and kind of
Agreed.
understanding there's going to be
Yes.
that reciprocity on the back end. And it sounds like that served you really well in your career.
Yeah, you know, in fact, I remember when I did just the workout, not even supplement advice, but when I did Shortcut to Size, everybody asked me, how much are they paying you? And I'm like, nothing. And they're like, what? You lived in Boise for over a week shooting all that content, right? You put it up there, it's free to everyone, and you didn't get paid, you're stupid. And I'm like, I'm not stupid. I'm giving them a chance to see what I can deliver.
Yeah.
You know, how are you going to know? You know what I'm saying? Like, if there's a cover charge at the club, how are you going to know how good it is inside? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You got to pay just to see how good it is. I'm like, this way they can see how effective my programs are, and then they're going to want more.
Yeah, and you do see that. You see time and time again, you know, individuals, companies, entities who they try to kind of silo away all their you know, premium stuff, and they basically silo themselves into obscurity, you know, out of the public
Yep.
eye, and you know,
Yeah.
whatever brand recognition they had starts to die off, whatever popularity they had starts to dwindle, and the popularity, the brand recognition, that's not something that you can just fire it back up in an instant. You know, that's something that
No.
builds slowly over time. And when you have it going, you got to keep it going. So, yeah, I think you've had a lot of foresight in terms of how you've navigated this ever shifting landscape. But I'm really dying to hear, Jim. You know, we've kind of gone through these stages of the career, getting into, you know, your own website, the supplement line. But we're still talking about like bodybuilding.com days, the forum days. And like you said, Jim, people could not understand the size and scope of bodybuilding.com at its peak. It was where fitness happened on the internet, period.
Yes.
And nowadays
Literally.
people haven't even heard of it. But what has your
Yeah,
experience?
the forums just recently got closed down.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know if you guys knew that, but you can no longer access them, which was kind of like a death of an era. And
Yeah, they've
Yeah.
been sold so many times.
Yeah.
I still have some connection with them. So, but we were trying to help revive them, but it's
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible.
Like
at
I
this
said,
It ain't
stage.
it's such a
2013.
momentum thing, you know. Once it dwindles, it's really hard to
Yeah.
fire that back up. But I am curious, you know, from someone who has seen it all in this industry and seen it gone through so many phases, what's your kind of state of the union right now as we've shifted into this brave new world of it's all social media, it's immediate content. Content demand has gone through the roof. It feels like if you're not publishing a video every day, you're too slow and you're falling behind. So, what's it been like for you? You know, having so much experience in this industry, you know, how do you assess the kind of current state of, you know, sharing evidence-based fitness content in this environment?
It's interesting, you know. It's the I would have never predicted so much change in just the last 10 years. You know, I remember people would come up to me all the time and go, I want to do what you do. And I'm like, well, good luck, because there's not many opportunities for it. You know what I mean? You needed to, you know, you couldn't just pop up on, there were a few YouTubers, like, I don't know if you remember Michael Chang. He had all those videos. And then do you remember Scooby? That guy
Oh yeah,
Oh
Scooby
yeah,
yeah,
used to wear the
Scooby.
bucket hat
yeah,
Yeah,
and be in his
100%.
backyard. You know, but I can't even remember where I was going with that.
you were just saying that you
Opportunities.
couldn't imagine all the change
Yeah.
in the last 10 years, and then how scarce opportunities are now to kind of break through.
It's very, you know, like I said, there was only a few of us doing it back, you know, back in the day. And now it's just, you know, like I said, I would say, you know, good luck doing what I do. You know, usually you have to have, you know, like I'm the science editor of Muscle and Fitness while I've got a Twitter, you know what I mean? Like I'm not just, hey, I'm Jim Stoppani, I like fitness, and now I'm on Twitter, you know what I mean? Like you had to have some cachet, you know what I mean? Like you had to be tied to something, you know, and it wasn't just me going, I'm the expert. It's, you know, Muscle and Fitness going, listen to our expert. It's bodybuilding.com going, listen to our expert. And then you take it to social media and people go, oh, that's the guy from, you know what I mean? Whereas now, you know, it's sort of the Justin Bieber path, you know what I mean? Where you to get into Muscle and Fitness back in 2000, you know what I mean? You either had to be an amazing trainer, you know, or you had to know somebody. You know what I mean? It was very hard to just go, hey, I want to be an expert. You know what I mean? In whatever area, whether it's law, whether it's medicine, whether it's training, whether it's finance. You know, now all it takes is a phone. You know, and like you were saying, you know, do people want to listen to the guy with 40 years of experience and a doctorate, or do they just want the guy with the bluest eyes, the blondest hair, and the best pecs? You know, and so it gives, you know, there's good and bad. Like I said, you know, like we wouldn't have Justin Bieber if it wasn't for YouTube, right? Good and bad of it, but some people love Justin Bieber, right? But you know what I'm saying? So there wouldn't be a lot of experts that we now know if you couldn't just pick up your phone and you know, start. But there's also, you know, a lot of misinformation because of it. You know, with the magazines, getting into the magazine, it was vetted, it was filtered. You know, there were other editors, me, going, no, that's, you know, that's not how a muscle, that's not the physiology, that's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what was nice about that was not only did it allow me to filter the information, but what I did was I turned the magazine into more of a manual, meaning like, I don't care if Men's Health has an article this month going, low carb is the only way to lose weight. And then the next month they go, low carb will kill you. And it's just like, wait a minute. You guys last month just said low carb was the way to go. Now you've got a new writer in there who's saying, you know, we can't do this at this magazine. It has to be consistent. We have to have, you know, consistent information that goes month. Sure, some things can change, but we can't say, you know, HIIT is the best thing this month, and then next month say it's the worst thing, you know? And so that's what I appreciated about it, is we could filter it, we could vet it, and we could make the information consistent so that the reader's not like all over the place. Like, oh, 1 month you said this, next month you said that. It was more of a manual, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nowadays, not only do you not get the manual, but you're literally, so back in 2000, when you wanted to know about something, you had that thought, okay, bench press. I want to know if I bring my elbows in, then you go to internet. Right now, nobody does that because you pick up your phone and you're bombarded, and it's whatever's in your feed. That's what you learned today. Whatever's in your feed. You don't have the time to go, geez, I wonder if a keto diet will lower my, you know what I mean? Like, you're bombarded with the information all day long. And so you're just like picking
you're
through
more reactive
whatever.
than proactive.
Yeah,
in
it's
terms
more
of
reactive
seeking things
than
out. Yeah.
contemplative, or, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and so I think people are kind of more like fragmented, not, you know, like I think it's great that there's so much information just on your phone, but it's kind of all over the place. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Versus, you know, like a place where you can kind of get a full spectrum of it, you know, how to train, how to eat, what, you know, what stays the same, what changes, periodization, yada, yada. And today is just kind of like, you know, this guy says I should do flies this, okay, that's, you know, that's my focus for today. You know, and so I think that's the sad thing. I'm not sure how to explain what I'm saying, but like,
No, I totally get it. Yeah.
I
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
in many
even though there's
ways,
more information and you can, like, you know, you could AI anything. Oh, does a low carb diet, you know what I mean? And get a sort of an answer. People aren't really thinking full picture, if you will. You know what I mean? Because of the way the information comes in.
Yeah.
And it's so much different information, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up a few points I want to highlight there, because I think they're so pertinent right now in the fitness space as it pertains to content. I mean, first of all, you know, you mentioned if someone were to ask you, how do I do what you do? How do I replicate your path? And you're like, I I don't know. I feel like what's really ironic about it is that, you know, when you were coming up, and to a lesser extent, even like when Helms and I were kind of getting into this space, there were fewer total opportunities, and yet it was kind of easier to go out there and make a name for yourself. Whereas now, because the barrier to entry of just saying, I'm going to do fitness content is so low, it's like everyone has an opportunity now to get out there, which means that the ability to actually rise to prominence with this massive amount of content out there, it's almost like there's more opportunities, which makes it prohibitively difficult to actually separate yourself and stand out and rise to some level of notoriety.
Yes, agreed.
Another thing that you mentioned, which is there's so many pros and cons to it. I do find it to be a net negative if I'm showing my cards. But, you know, you mentioned there used to be established entities that publish knowledge and information. And there was an editorial process, you know, kind of a top-down filtering of what is evidence-based content. And now I think what we see is, because it's so decentralized and fragmented, as you said, with content creation, instead of being a top-down approach of filtering that information, now it's a bottom-up approach.
Yes.
And instead of like kind of funneling it toward an expert to say yes or no or maybe, now it's kind of just like a vote counting mechanism where it's just whatever's most engaging is going to get amplified the most. And so that's where you see, like, you know, like you're mentioning, Jim, you're like looking at the content, and one day low carb is the best thing ever. The next day it's the worst thing ever. And it's because, you know, we're naturally going to be upvoting, you know, metaphorically speaking, the things that are most polarizing, instead of having that kind of centralized filter that says, well, you're both a little bit off base here. Let me kind of like write an article that makes sense of this, you know? So no, it's interesting to see how that's affected content creation. And then also, Jim, the last thing I'll say is I kind of, you know, steal the mic from poor Helms this episode. It's been interesting to watch how that has impacted not just content creation, but content consumption.
Yeah.
Because like you said, Jim, there's been this downstream effect where people are yanked in so many directions. Everything is kind of trending towards short form, and everything is very sensationalized. So it's like you open up. It used to be, Helms, you remember, you set aside 25 minutes, you open up Muscle and Fitness magazine, you say, I wonder what Jim thought was his most important thing to write in his column this month. You know, like he had many things on the drawing board, filtered them into what he felt was most important to say this month, and I'm going to dive into this article and read it. And now it's like you open up your phone, and on your Instagram grid, you see 9 different headlines. They're all 60 seconds long. They're completely contradictory, and you're just like, I guess I'll just pick one today and see what happens and just reshuffle the deck tomorrow. And it's so difficult to actually make sense of that into any kind of cohesive, any kind of cohesive worldview about how all this fitness stuff fits together and makes sense. But Helms, I'm very uncharacteristic. I've been hogging the mic. Helms, I'm gonna mute my mic literally and let you take it away from here.
I like that you feel the need to actually like physically restrain yourself, but I think that Trex, you've done a fantastic job. I've been loving the questions you've asked, and I think because you came up in the era where Jim was coming up as in his career, your questions have been spot on. Very many of the same things, I would say. What I find really interesting, though, is I think because I started my science communication career maybe a decade, it probably it's a stretch before you kind of started yours.
Yeah, because
you were setting the groundwork.
Yeah,
though.
I was like, not that I recommend this necessarily, but I said I'm gonna go get my PhD and stay out of this stuff for the most part, and then say, okay, I did my time.
Now I'm ready.
I paid my dues, and now I'm ready. In hindsight, that was probably a mistake, but anyway, as you were.
Yeah, because I remember the first time that I started viewing you personally, and this is not necessarily a reflection of when you were capable or when you were as a content creator, was sometime around 2014, 2015. And I had been a trainer, and we had started 3D Muscle Journey, and I'd done my muscle and strength, videos, somewhere in the decade prior to that. So it was interesting for me to kind of be coming up just on the heels while you were the consumer, and I was a bit of both. And one thing I've realized as we've talked about this, Jim, is that the changing nature of information has also changed the role of the science communicator. If we look at historically science communication in society from a much broader lens, if we think Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, if we think it hasn't been, I have to correct the record and bust myths. There's a little bit of that, and that can be fun, but that was never the central role of Carl Sagan, as an example.
Yeah,
and
he wasn't going out,
describing,
pushing against this tide of all these people saying that the Earth is the center of the solar system. I need to go bust that myth once and for all,
Exactly. And that in many ways, and I want to hear your perspective on this once I kind of paint my view and kind of what I have seen, is that you didn't start in that role either, and that wasn't the role, because there were these platforms and you had to be platformed rather than creating your own. It was, for better or for worse, and I think Trex described it as a negative, and I don't disagree. There were systems in place and people vetting, and maybe they weren't always the best to be vetting, to give you the opportunity. But that means you had to have the resume. You had to be a IFBB pro. You had to be a trainer of champions. You had to be doing your postdoc at Yale and also be a trainer or what have you. And I think that created much more unity and the role of what university and education is supposed to be is, these are people studying this and there are educators, so we're going to leverage them. And there was not a narrative of this experience versus science that has come up in the last, I'm going to say 15 years. That is when I first started noticing it. There was a period where that would be a ridiculous statement, even when I started. Like, why? You know, like you were talking about Trex, people were more quote unquote well rounded in choosing where they got their information from. I don't even think we thought of it that way. That, oh, I need to get the information from the IFBB Pro and the doctor. It was just I need information on how to get as jacked as possible. There's very little scientific information, but of course I would go to someone who is studying this, and of course I would go to someone who has trained for 20 years and achieved a high level in this sport. But they aren't on opposite sides. And with the death of the expert, which I think we can trace back to many societal changes, but one of them is this. Exactly what we're talking about is that there is no barrier to entry. Anyone and everyone can produce content. And now, because you're competing for someone's attention span, you say the most shocking thing. What you were annoyed about the inconsistency at, say, Men's Health, is actually now a strategy, purposeful. We
Yeah.
have rage bait is a thing. I'm going to actively make content that makes you angry, right?
Yep.
I am going to say something that leverages your cynicism and your conspiratorial problems that are almost politically rooted or culturally rooted. If you look at the low carb movement, Gary Taubes' narrative, he crafted a narrative of, the Ansel Keys conspiracy, 7 country study, and the DRI guidelines and the medical establishment, all to try to keep us unhealthy. Now we have doctors hate him as the, so,
Yes.
and then, so somewhere around the time I was coming up, all of the people who were after your generation who are modeling the what is the evidence-based practitioner kind of archetype, they were dealing with that, the initial beginnings of it. They created their own platform, their own websites, or they were the moderators on the bodybuilding.com forums. We're talking about Lane Norton, Alan Aragon, Straight Flexed was his username on the bodybuilding.com forums. We're talking about Lyle McDonald. We're talking about this era of people who were very confrontational, and the primary thing they were doing was not telling you what to do. It's not curated content like a manual that you were saying. They were telling you what not to do because there was so much content that you needed to be disabused of as getting miseducated. And the anti-guru was essentially the archetype, which I found really fascinating because previous to that, it was the guru who also was typically evidence-based, and sometimes that was marketing, sometimes it actually was just, these are the people we put up in society, maybe too much, but nonetheless, it's because of their knowledge or because of their status, and it includes that. And it became inverted to where the role of the science communicator was whack-a-mole. And now it isn't, it's, we're so far away from being in a desert of information and not having access to good information that we are oversaturated with information that the average consumer can't tell the difference between what is actually evidence-based and what is not. So the evidence-based content creator is left with needing to kind of do all of it, create their own space, and it is very confusing. It's tough. I don't envy anyone coming up right now because you're combating misinformation, and now you're actually combating disinformation because it's a content strategy to get eyeballs on you. And somewhere in when you're doing that, you also have to have your own brand identity, presence, and you have to know the marketing strategies that take just as much time to learn as the science itself, and then have a consistent message of actually giving people practical, useful information. And I think even within the evidence-based niche, there are people who find sub-niches, like I am the anti-guru whack-a-mole person, or I'm going to just give you the really practical info, or I need to niche down on just biomechanics. So that's kind of what I've seen and how it's changed. And I'm curious how you have navigated that changing role of who is the lifter with the PhD. And it sounds like you've just kind of stayed as an educator, but I've also been very impressed in that you've got a huge following on Instagram and YouTube. That wasn't always the case. How did you stay relevant on these social media platforms that themselves have changed since their inception substantially?
I think the biggest thing is just communicating with, like you were saying, before you didn't get immediate feedback. Now, you get immediate feedback, and I try to get all those, people with legitimate questions, even if they want to debate, at least a response. And so I think that's critical is the interaction with,
Hmm.
the people who want to make a comment, whether it's a question, whether it's a debate, but it's, being there and showing them that you're paying attention to them. You're not just putting up content and going, "Oh, say what the hell ever you want to say. I've I've stated my piece." But you're coming back and, saying, "Oh, you have diabetes? Well, maybe try this then for this." Or, "Oh, yeah, that might not work for you if you've, just simple like, oh, you found the opposite, great. It sounds like you know what works for you. Ignore this. Every individual is an individual. My information is not a, fix for everyone." It's just giving them something and showing that you're invested in communicating with them, because
Hmm.
everybody wants to kind of feel like, oh, he listened to me. He gave me a response. And, that's one of the things I get all the time. People are like, wow, I didn't expect you to reply, you know,
Hmm.
to my question, but thank you so much. And so I think that's critical. Like I said, I really haven't changed my strategies. I don't do the, you know, here I am with a green screen of another video and I'm going, this guy's so wrong, like, go do what you want to say, you know what I mean? Like that, that's not my role to clean it up, like, yes,
Hmm.
there's a lot of misinformation out there, but I don't see that as my role. And in fact, I've had people on my media team that have brought them go, what if you do, I've seen these videos where this lawyer comes on and she plays a video of another lawyer and then goes, no, that's not how the law, you're supposed to, what if Jim did that? And I'm just like, I know everybody's doing that. I know it's a strategy. It would probably get us views, but I'm like, I don't want to be that guy.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
just don't want
think.
to be that. I I try to be positive, like kind of like you were saying, like, they'll just tell you what not to do. In fact, we had a writer back at Muslim Fitness, and most of his articles were like that. It's like, if your gym doesn't have these three pieces of equipment, you need to quit the gym and find a new one. And I'm like, these aren't helpful articles. Like, we need to tell people what to do, not,
Mm.
what not to do. You know what I mean? Like, oh, this supplement sucks. And it's just like, no, we don't need to tell them what supplement sucks. We need to tell them what supplement will work. Which ones, like, this isn't, I understand what you're trying to do, but like, we need, we need to provide them advice. Like, not just don't do this, but then what do you do? That's the most important thing. And so I've always tried to stay on the positive side of the information, versus on the negative side. Every once in a while, somebody, Gary, what's his name, Brecka, might put out some ridiculous thing about how you can take branch chains while you're fasting. And it's just like, no, you cannot take branch chains. And, sometimes I'll have to come on and do a video on that. Somebody like Gary, I may do a video and explain why you can't take leucine and still be fasted, because leucine actually tells the hypothalamus that you're in a fed state. So,
yeah.
um, so, but most of the time I'm just trying to be very positive on the information.
And it sounds to me, if I can psychoanalyze you a little bit, or provide some commentary, it sounds to me like you are ultimately just kind of staying true to what you mentioned like an hour ago, which is you were told, hey, people are investing in your development as a scholar. That's what a PhD is. It's usually people or organizations footing the bill, and people investing a lot in your training. So you now have a responsibility to put that to use and go
Yep.
educate people. And so to me, that's kind of the underlying through line, the kind of theme, which is when you're talking about, well, I don't just post and run away. I engage with people. That's what a teacher does. A teacher doesn't give a lecture, and when someone says, I had a question on slide 8, they don't say, sorry,
Yeah.
too
Sorry.
bad.
Figure it out.
So yeah, engaging with people, answering those questions to the extent it's reasonable. Obviously, if you have a
Yeah.
huge following, you can't answer them all. But yeah, and then telling people what to actually do, giving them something useful that they can go out and implement. And I think what's really interesting is content creators that don't drive themselves insane. I think they basically find their mission, their calling, or what they enjoy doing, and they kind of stick with it throughout all the trends and the changes in the industries. And like, I know for me, I'm definitely guilty of writing a fair number of the what not to do articles, but the reason
Sure.
I don't go for the low hanging fruit. Like I don't go for like someone who's clearly giving bad information and talking about why it's bad. I really like engaging with the things I disagree about from people I very much respect. Like really legit peers
Yep.
in evidence-based fitness who have excellent content, and the article isn't this guy's an idiot and I dislike him and you shouldn't listen to him. It's I wonder why two qualified people see this so differently and kind
Yeah.
of digging into the
Yes.
nuance. And
I love it. Yeah.
it does not do well on social media.
No.
I can tell you that.
That's yeah.
But
That would
it's what
that does well in academia. That's what
yeah
academia is. You know what I mean?
yeah
We all have a respect for one another, right? We respect our backgrounds, right? It's like you said, two experts, but we see differently on this one mechanism or whatever it is, and it's it that's that's playing too nice, I think, to be
yeah.
popular
Oh
anywhere
yeah.
else other than academia.
And with that kind of article, you got to be about 3,500 words into it before you start to really get the feel for
Yes.
it. So, but anyway, my main point was I think there's something to be said about finding. There's a million different ways to do content, and just finding. For me to be in this for the next 20 years rather than the next 20 months, you got to find what excites you, what kind of intellectually stimulates you. And I think it's really impressive, Jim, just the way that you have been involved in this industry at the absolute highest of levels and stayed as relevant as ever over such a drastically changing landscape. Basically, you've basically weathered three different industries. They may all be fitness, but they are not the same industry. So I just think that's a testament to you finding that mission as a communicator and sticking to it, and just keeping up with the ever shifting landscape. It's just super impressive.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
I had a similar comment, and I think it also goes beyond just finding what works for your personality and your values. I think that's
Yes.
critical. I think that's a non-negotiable if someone wants to have longevity, and be relevant with longevity, rather than just I do this on the side, but I've gone from 100 to 300 subscribers in the last 10 years kind of deal. There's plenty of those you can find. It's like, oh, you really love doing fun with flags, to shout out to like Big Bang Theory, but you only have the 10 followers. But I think to be relevant and still doing what you love long term, there is one other piece, and that is, I think some people who don't get this would have listened to your story and went, oh, he saw beyond. Like he knew that print was going to go to video, and then he knew that video and websites were going to go to apps, and then he knew that apps were going to go to social media. And I think less than being focused on the specific medium, you were always very aware of what do people need, and it's practical, useful advice that is communicated in the most effective way, and you weren't afraid to change when there became a new, more effective way, and you also weren't afraid to just go out there and do something even if it meant that there wasn't an immediate payoff. And I think those are personality traits and a perspective that kind of actually are above the noise. They're very relevant noise that you do have to pay attention to, of what's the changing landscape of media, communication, and society. In that when it comes to fitness, people are always going to be wanting practical information and want to know, what do I do in the kitchen and what do I do in the gym? And being told what not to do is useful in a very, very loud, noisy space that is oversaturated. But ultimately, you're getting told what not to do, and then you go, okay, cool. But now what do I do? Now
Yeah.
you've taken me out of the wrong place, and then what?
Right.
And
But I
I
still don't
think
know what to
you
do.
have,
I know
yeah,
what not to
exactly.
do.
Exactly, right? And I think the thing that you have always seen is, what's the best way for me to tell them that? And communication is something that has not really changed since the dawn of people speaking. And there are ways to get it through, but ultimately, whether it's the written word, whether it's a video, or whether it's an image, or whether it's a caption, Um, I think there are fundamental principles that if you understand that, and that is basically why a 75-year-old professor who is an excellent educator at a university will still have you completely in rapture if they're a good educator, not just someone who studied the topic for 30 years in their lecture, even though, online you might be like, whatever, boomer. But if you sit in that chair, you're in that class, you'll be like, oh my God, this storyteller he knows exactly how to get my attention, and I listened. And I think we all have memories of someone multiple generations older than us in our education who typically inspired us as an educator. And that still comes across whether you're on TikTok, Instagram, whether you know how to communicate that via the written word, or whether you know how to do that on YouTube. And I think, and I would be curious to say, like, do you think it's been more that you have a good savvy eye for how the information industry is changing, or is it that you've kept your eye on the ball of education, or some combination of the two?
I mean, I think it's just like you said, the focus has been on educating
Hmm.
and not steering away from that,
Yeah.
and not sort of, pigeonholing, if you will, yourself, like you said, being able to change and adapt how you deliver that information. It's still the same information,
Yeah.
right? So that's never changed. So the way I deliver it, the type of information it is, I think the consistency is most important, and then the flexibility of being able to go, hey, you know, now an app, now social media, now TikTok, now, you know, being there, and what's next. I don't really know that. I never would have predicted this many fitness influencers. If you asked
Yeah.
me 10 years ago, I never would have imagined the landscape would look like this. Never. Like, never. So no, I don't know. I'm really not that savvy. It's simply just sticking with, who I am, like you said, my values, my style of educating, and really not wavering from that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it seems to me you've always had a clear idea of what you want to do. You have a message to share, and you're willing to go where the people are in order to share it.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it may be a website, it may be a magazine, it may be TikTok.
Yeah. And it gets back to, like you said, that responsibility,
Yeah.
to, share what I've learned with as many people who are willing to listen.
Yeah. All right, beautiful. Well, Helms, I think it's probably time to wrap this up. I want to have obviously a bunch of respect for Jim's time here. Like I said many times before, just such a privilege to have you on. Such a walk down memory lane, and just coming full circle with my personal fitness journey. So appreciative of your time, and I want to give you an opportunity right now. I'm sure a lot of people in our audience, this may be their first time hearing from you. So if people want to find you, find your content, if you want to talk about some current projects or products that you have on offer, the floor is yours. Where can people find you and support you?
Yeah. I mean, all I'll say is you can find me on any social media platform, whether it's YouTube, uh, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, uh, what else? But it's Jim. Look up Jim Stoppani, or you can go to jimstoppani.com, which is my website and app.
Awesome. And I know the supplement line is still going strong, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Beautiful. All
Yeah. But
right.
I'm not. I'm not. In these formats, it's not about promoting anything. It's really just about sharing information. So
Yeah. And we
thank you
appreciate
guys.
it. All right.
Yeah, I
Well,
just want to say I appreciate you modeling what is possible, and it was really cool for me, especially to hear that that was modeled to you as well, even though it was in a different format.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
um, I think that's important. People say this sometimes in certain circles, like, representation matters, and I think it really does. I think to know that there is a career path for you, and to know that people like you can do a thing, it opens up more opportunities, sometimes for better or for worse in the modern landscape of, oh, I can be an influencer too. But but hey, I think Eric and I have both expressed how you were part of that for us. So
Well, thank you.
yeah,
I really appreciate hearing that. So it means a lot.
And I've
got
never
it,
thought
man.
about that way. It's kind of terrifying. I'm rethinking all my behaviors and writings and activities of the last 10 years, thinking, who have I ruined with the example I'm setting? So, Jim, I'm afraid I broke that chain of people inspiring and giving good influences. But yeah, like Helm said,
Nonsense.
there would be no iron culture, I would say, without Jim Stoppani doing his thing back in the day. So, truly a huge honor to have you on the show. I do hope our listeners will support you in all your current and future endeavors. And that is going to do it for episode 338 of Iron Culture. Everyone, thanks so
Wow.
much for joining us. And we will be back next week with yet another episode.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank